Well, it is so good to be with you, and it was so awesome to hear your prayers. I was just moved literally to tears just hearing as you prayed, and that was just so powerful. And so we didn't want it to end, and so somehow I'm going to have to try to cut my message down a little bit. Thanks for praying so well. But we're in Exodus chapter 19, and we're going to be starting in Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, as we've been on this journey through what we've called the land between. We've been looking at these land between moments as we look at Moses. And maybe you're like, I know that chapter, but more likely than not, you're like, I'm kind of know we're in Exodus, but what's coming? Are you ready for the big topic we're going to tackle today? It's the 10 Commandments. You've all heard the 10 Commandments somehow, and when you are preparing a message, you want to make sure that you're taking the word and you're expounding on it correctly and properly and doing honor to it, but then you're also wrestling, and this is how I'm wrestling with God, like, we've heard this before. What do you want us to hear? How do you want us to dig into this? How do you want us to understand it? And so I want to start with a story. The story was a Supreme Court decision here in the U.S. that took place on June 27th, 2005. The case was called Van Orden versus Perry. Perry being the governor of Texas. The case involved 10 Commandment statues being on government grounds. And this is what the Supreme Court ruled. Among the 21 historical markers and 17 monuments surrounding the Texas state capitol is a 6-foot-high monolith inscribed with the 10 Commandments. The legislative record illustrates that after accepting the monument from the Fraternal Order of Eagles, a national social, civic, and patriotic organization, the state selected a site for it based on the recommendation of the state organization that maintains the Capitol grounds. Petitioner, an Austin resident who encounters the monument during his frequent visits to those grounds, brought this 42 U.S.C. 1983 suit seeking a declaration that the monument's placement violates the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, in an injunction requiring its removal. Holding that the monument did not contrive the clause, the district court found that the state had a valid secular purpose in recognizing and commending the Eagles for their efforts to reduce juvenile delinquency, and that a responsible observer, mindful of history, purpose, and context, would not conclude that this passive monument conveyed the message that the state endorsed religion. The Fifth Circuit Court affirmed. In other words, the 10 Commandment statue could stay. On June 27th, 2017, the 10 Commandments were installed at the state capitol. This is the headline: 10 Commandments installed at Arkansas State Capitol. ACLU plans lawsuit. Here's some quotes from the NPR article. We have a beautiful Capitol grounds, but we did not have a monument that actually honored the historical moral foundation of law, Republican Senator Jason Rappert told reporters. And today, we have now, through the support of people all over the country, mostly from Arkansas, been able to erect this monument at zero taxpayer expense. The ACLU of Arkansas says it will sue to remove the monument from the Capitol grounds with this quote: "At a time when we do not need any more religious conflict and divisiveness in the world and in this country, it violates the First Amendment promise of religious liberty to all." Rita Schuyler, the group's executive director, told NPR, "By placing a monument to a particular set of religious beliefs, it appears that the state enforces one particular set of beliefs over others and over no religion. And it makes people who fall into those categories, no religion or other religion, feel like second-class citizens in the state of Arkansas, which they are not." So my question is, why are the 10 Commandments so controversial? Why is there this constant battle over them? my first take and approach, my first draft of this message, was to look at the moral law. The fact that you can look at least 6 of the 10 commandments, and you could say that is written on every man's heart, no matter what their background is. For instance, would you and your neighbor debate if it's right to murder or to steal? You wouldn't. And so that was one argument, one approach. But as I dug into what God was calling us to do, I realized we had to go a little deeper than that, a little different. Because, as I've mentioned numerous weeks, I've been on this intellectual journey of trying to understand the mind of someone who believes there is no God. And this is a quote from Christopher Hitchens. "No society ever discovered has failed to protect itself from self-evident crimes like those supposedly stipulated at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments." He basically affirms the moral law of the 10 Commandments, that no society has ever not lived these out. But then he uses this quote: "It would be harder to find an easier proof that religion is man-made." He uses the 10 Commandments as his proof that there is no God. I could go on and argue with it, but he would say you could have the 10 Commandments without faith. But my argument is that God has placed that law on every man's heart. But it still wouldn't address why they're so divisive. We could argue that part, and we'll get to where God is claimed in the 10 Commandments. But the context of the 10 Commandments is what proves people like Hitchens wrong, and what proves why they are divisive. Because they point to one true God, one true source of truth, one God over every other quote-unquote God that people choose to worship. If we think of the context that we've been in through Exodus, the whole journey was God not only rescuing the Israelites out of their slavery and bondage of Egypt, but what else was it about? Him proving dominance over all the gods of the Egyptians. We've talked about that. We've looked at that, how God, time and time again, was showing that He is God Almighty. Throughout the Old Testament, we see this. We see this through the prophets. We see this through the kings. There's this constant battle of people having these gods that they think are gods, and God proving that He is the God unlike any other. He is the one true God. And so we get this in chapter 19, a summary. We get to see this event happen, and we see God's real heartbeat behind the 10 Commandments before we get to it. And so chapter 19 will kind of set us up for chapter 20, which is where the 10 Commandments are. Exactly 2 months after the Israelites left Egypt, they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. I'm on page 62. If you want to use a chair Bible, I'd encourage you to do so. After breaking camp, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and set up a camp there at the base of Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai was where? It was where Moses had experienced the burning bush. And now God had brought them back to the same place. Remember, Moses experienced this burning bush. That's how he knew his calling to go back to Egypt. And he goes back, and now they've seen God work, and they're back at the same place. Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord God called to him from the mountain and said, "Give these instructions to the family of Jacob. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all peoples on earth, for all the earth belongs to me. And you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel." In these few verses, we actually see 4 very important things that we have to understand to the context of the 10 Commandments. Number 1, Verse 4 shows us that it is God who rescued the Israelites. It was not Moses who rescued them. It was not the Israelites themselves who rescued themselves. It wasn't Pharaoh letting them go that rescued them. Who was it that rescued them? God. It was his goodness and his love, and have hearing of their cries, he rescued them. But what does he say? He says, you know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, the eagle is a very interesting bird. And I find that it's very interesting that God would actually use that example. Because the eagle is both a bird of prey and a bird of supremacy. Supremacy. My youngest son, they've been going, Jessica takes him to the library because it's like, we don't need any more books, and these are free, and then you return them. It's great. And they come back with all these animal books. And just now, Owen, the youngest, brought home this book called Birds of Prey. And it's all about learning about how these birds, what they eat and those kind of things. Well, what we know about the eagle is that the eagle is a bird of prey. What does that mean? That it actually can grab something and take it. Egypt was the oppression, or was the prey that God was taking care of. Israelite was being rescued. But the eagle is also a bird of supremacy. And what this is meaning or intending is at the top of the food chain, where is the eagle? The very top. The eagle doesn't have many predators, except for people like us, humans, who hunt them. But if you look at the animal kingdom and the animal food chain, the eagle is supreme. And so God is what? Supreme. And he's the one who is over the oppression. He's over the Egyptians. And he actually is the one rescuing out the Israelites. That's one point. We also see that God's blessing and authority is revealed. This is in verse 5. Now, if you obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all the people on earth. For all the earth belongs to me. Now, the first thing is God's authority. All of the earth belongs to who? To Robert Wendt? No. It belongs to God. All the authority belongs to God. All of the earth belongs to God. Whose covenant was it? Was it the covenant of the Israelites? No. It was God's covenant. It was his plan, his way, his authority. And what does the verse tell us? That if you follow my covenant, being God's covenant, if you understand that God has authority, what will happen to you? There's blessing. You see how it says that if you obey, now if you obey and keep my covenant, you will be my what? Own special treasure from among all the peoples on the earth. God's blessing is to obey and keep my commands, and you will be my special treasure. Now, verse 6 shows us the third thing. We see the empowerment of his followers. Verse 6 says this, and you will be my kingdom of priests in a holy nation. What I find amazing about God is that he empowers us. I just want you to think about that for a second. What did he say that they would be? That they would be priests. As followers of Jesus, did you know that we are priests and kings? I want you to hear that again. That we are priests and kings. Maybe someone's never told you that before. And so you're going to go home and you're going to say, I'm King Robert. But if we look at Revelation, the very last book of the Bible, it's found in Revelation chapter 5. There's this thing that John is having this vision of everything at the end. And these scrolls are being opened up. And it's Jesus opening these up. And this is what we see it record. You are worthy to take the scroll and break its seal and open it. You were slaughtered, and your blood has ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. What is it saying? Look, Jesus, it's been your blood on the cross that ransomed people of God from every tribe and language, people and nation. And you have caused them to become a kingdom of what? Priests for our God. And they will reign on earth. Now I'm going to have you do a little Bible flipping. Are you ready for it? I want you to go all the way to 1 Peter. It's page 1024. It's going to be almost all the way to the back. And I want you to see something else that Peter writes. Now, Peter is who? Peter is one of the disciples of Jesus. He's the one who Jesus says, Peter, on this rock I will build my church. This same Peter, this is who is writing this. So Revelation was a vision John recorded. This is what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 to 10. Verse 8. They stumble, this is the second part of it, because they do not obey God's word, and so they meet the fate that was planned for them. But you are not like that. You are a chosen people. You are a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for He called you out of darkness and into His wonderful light. Once you had no identity as a people, now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, now you have received mercy. Here's the point. If you claim Jesus to be the Savior of your life, if you claim to be walking with Him, you have been appointed as priests. Every time someone finds out that I'm a pastor, everything about them changes. I was just at a golf outing a couple weekends ago, and it was for one of the youth football team that our kids are a part of. And the one guy, I never met him before. In about hole 3, he finds out I'm a pastor. From hole 4 to hole 18 and throughout dinner, he called me preach the whole time. From hole 1 to 3, his language was pretty awful. From hole 4 to 18, it was clean as could be. Everything changed. I never did. He just found out what I did. Did you know I'm not the only pastor here? That we're all called to live in such a way that we carry Christ. Now, I wasn't sitting there condoning him or making him feel bad or being like, oh, I'm so holy on this pedestal of this golf cart. No. But what I was doing was I was able to be a light to him. I was able to share. And people should know that as our identity. That number one, we are followers of Jesus. And they should see that in us. They should see us living that out. We should bring that light because we are a kingdom of priests. And why do we have this? Because once we had no identity, we were just like those who don't know God. But when we received Him and understood Him, now we became His people. Once we had no mercy. Why? Because we didn't know the one who brings the mercy or gives the mercy, but now we've received that mercy. Everything changes. This is the heartbeat of God, a God who empowers our followers. He did it in Exodus, and He does it in Revelation. He stays the same from beginning to end. He is a God that never changes. And following the Lord is full of blessing and goodness. From then until now, we experience it. But how do we experience the blessing and goodness of God? If we submit to His ways and His will. It's one thing to say that we know God. It's another thing to walk like we know God. Exodus 19, verses 9 to 25. I'll just save you the reading for the sake of time. I want to encourage you to read it on your own. But the people are consecrated. And why are they consecrated? Because how can they stand before God if they're not clean? And so they're consecrated so that they can be clean and they can stand before a holy God. And then we're going to get to verse 20, where the 10 Commandments happen. But this is the context that I wanted to set up. as we dig into this and as we see this, before we get to this big moment, we see a couple things. God says, I'm the one who rescued you. It's my blessing that comes out of my authority for those who follow me. I empower you to be priests. But what's all about it? Knowing Him. Knowing His ways, knowing His word, knowing who He is. So here's my question for us priests who carry out the good news of God and Jesus. Here's my question. We fight for the 10 Commandments on our Capitol grounds and in our places, but do we know them? Simple question. Do we actually know what we're fighting for? Do we know what they are? I was a young guy in ministry, very cocky, very arrogant. I thought I knew it all. And there was this pastor, he was an associate pastor of our church, and his name was Pastor Craig. And he took me under his wing, and he said, I'm going to teach you things for the next year. Lesson number 1, the 10 Commandments. He said, do you know the 10 Commandments? Can you say them? I start stumbling. I think it's like God's first, then something about the Sabbath. Don't murder. I know honor your father and mother. And he looks at me and he goes, come on now. I'm like, I'm a little nervous. He's like, you need to know the 10 Commandments. For an entire year, every day I saw him. What are the 10 Commandments? What are the 10 Commandments? What are the 10 Commandments? And he drilled it in me so that I would understand the 10 Commandments. Why is this important? Well, some faith traditions ask kids to remember them at a young age, and then when we become adults and we forget them. We know they're important, but the question becomes, why are they important? And the other question is, by knowing them and knowing why they're important, we also understand why they're divisive in our culture. It starts in verse 2. Chapter 20, verse 2, it says, starting in the chapter, then God gave the people all these instructions. Verse 2, what does He say? I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. What does He start before He gives them all these rules? Because this is how I viewed the 10 Commandments. I really don't want to know them because I don't want to really obey them. I know I'm going to break them at some point. I know that I'm really not going to carry them out. I really just like to live life in the gray. I don't like the black and white. I kind of want to know like how far I can go without going too far, but just far enough in my decision making. That's how I want to know. And the minute you draw a line, I don't really want to know it. And those rules, they're bad things because they hold me back from the things that I can accomplish. And if you think about it, a lot of times arguments are based that way. These rules, they're just oppressive, they're hard, they push us down. But what was God's reminder in verse 2? Remember what I did for you. Remember how I rescued you. Remember how I took you out of hundreds of years of slavery and I set you free. I am the Lord your God who did it. And that's how He sets the context of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments can be broken into what I would call the 64 or 46 rule, however you want to remember it. The last 6 are the ones that we can all agree on. The first 4 are the ones that make them so divisive. It's found in Mark chapter 12. It's page 842, where we actually get our mission statement as a church. One of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate. He realized that Jesus had answered well, so he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Maybe you recall this story. Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only God. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So why do we exist as a church? What's our mission? It's to love God and love people. It first starts by saying God is the only God. He's supreme. He is the one true God. That is loving God. I will worship Him. I will obey Him. I will surrender to Him. And then there's the other part, loving people. I will love the people around me. I will love my neighbor as myself. This is what Jesus says it all comes down to. If you break the commandments down, you'll see it breaks into this rule. So I'm going to breeze through them really fast. The last 6, and then I'm going to get back to the other 4. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 to 17 cover the final 6, and it really shows how you love others is a reflection of how you love God. So the first, 5th commandment, I know I'm kind of going to be a little confusing, but I want to cover 5 through 10 first. The 5th commandment is honor your father and mother. It comes with a blessing. Honor your father and mother, and it shall go well with you. What's the heartbeat of this commandment? The heartbeat of this commandment is the respect for authority. You might not have the greatest mother or father. You might not have had the greatest experience with your mom or dad, but guess what? You wouldn't be where you're at without your mom or dad. And there's a respect that you should have for them. There's a respect that you should have for those who are in authority in your life. The 6th commandment is to not kill. This is, I think, one that we can easily just say, well, I get that. But really at the heartbeat of do not murder is this, that God is the author and giver of life. And it's not for us to take our life in our own hands. It's for us to trust God's plan in all of that. From the womb to the tomb, He is the one who has created life. He is the one who is supreme over it. He is the author and He is the giver of it. And we should respect that. Number 7 is not to commit adultery. We see that Jesus really ups the bar. Sorry, men, this is not easy for us especially because statistically, men struggle with this the most. Because Jesus says what? To even look at a woman lustfully is to sin, to break it. And so we see God's grace and goodness and all of that and forgiveness, but here's the point to it. This commandment is about God's faithfulness and holiness. He desires for us to pursue holiness in our lives. Not committing adultery is about being faithful, staying committed. It's all about pursuing holiness, desiring to be more like Christ. You are not to steal. At the heartbeat of this is that God is our provider. He's the one who gives us everything we need. If you go into that shop and you steal something that is not yours, that's you saying, I don't really trust God to provide for me. I'm going to take it on my own. Well, I only had 2 pennies. It's okay to steal because I don't have much. But God says He takes care of the birds of the air. He takes care of the lilies. He takes care of all of creation. How much more would He take care of you? To steal is to say that God's not really going to provide for me. It's a lack of trust. You're not to bear false witness. This is not to lie. Why? Because God is the source of truth, and His truthfulness is an example to the world. Imagine if us as priests of Him are to be known as liars. Probably not a good witness. And the last thing is you're not to covet. This is really about appreciation. Do you appreciate what the Lord has given you? These are 6 commandments. 6 commandments that can easily be something that we embrace. But the first 4 are the ones that are about loving God. And those are the ones that really create the most controversy. Look at verse 3. It says this, you must have no other God but me. That's how he starts. That's the first commandment. This is a very divisive commandment And the reason is because this statement is divisive because it defines God as the only God. It says, look at, God is monotheistic. There is one God. There is not any other God. He is the only God. So on this, atheism is gone because God declares himself to be God. There is a God. Polytheism is gone because that means to worship more than one God, which is Hinduism and Buddhism, some of the larger polytheistic religions of the world. And those are gone based on that statement because there's one God. There's not many. And pantheism, that the whole universe is God, maybe Taoism and parts of Hinduism, that's gone by that one statement. So you want to know why it's divisive? Because all of a sudden you're left with very few religions to choose from. Most are gone. Because now God says, I am the one God. I am the one God, and you must have no other God but me. You talk to someone who's been going through recovery or the 12 steps of AA, the first 3 steps are to admit that we're powerless over alcohol and that our lives have become unmanageable. The second step is to come to believe the power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the third step is to make a decision to turn our will and our lives to the care of God who understands Him. What is this all about? It's all about saying, I can't do it without God. There's one God. Verses 4 through 6 is the second commandment, which is this: do not make yourself an idol. It says you must not make yourself an idol of any kind of image of anything in the heavens or the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I want you to just think about this. His jealousy that if you worship these other gods, your love for God must come first. I was really convicted of this one because I don't have idols in my home, like of gold and silver. I don't have things that maybe I put on my pedestal and worship or look to as God. But this is where I was convicted. When you wake up in the morning, what's the very first thing you look at? And I realized, I look at Twitter, I look at the news, I look at what the stock market's going to be doing for the day, and then I open my Bible. And I was convicted because I felt God say, you have 3 idols before me. Why don't you wake up in the morning and say, thank you, God, for giving me this day? Why don't you start your day with me, but you start your day with all those other things? We can easily say we don't have idols, but my question to you is when you wake up in the morning, what's the first thought that goes through your mind? What's the first thing that you do? And that will be a good indication of if you have idols in your life. Because God's desire is to lavish blessings on those who love and serve Him. But we have to depend on Him. The third commandment is to not misuse the Lord's name in vain. And this commandment is a challenging one. Because you could be like me, and I don't have much to brag about. I really don't. Here's one thing I can brag about. Ever since I was a kid, I've never said OMG, like actually said it. Like even if there was a song about it, I would like cringe on the inside. And I don't know why, I just never could say it. My one thing to brag about, okay? But that doesn't mean that I've upheld that commandment. Because at the end of the day, what's the most important thing that you have? It's really your name. Have you ever noticed if you go somewhere for the first time and someone remembers your name the second time you come back, how much better you feel? How when someone calls you out by name, how important and how good you feel because of it? But you didn't even choose your name. Your parents chose your name. The first person, Adam, he didn't choose his name. God chose it. The animals, they didn't choose their name. Adam named them. But here's the thing. God created His own name. Remember, Moses asked, who am I going to tell you that you are? And he says, I am. He names Himself. And so when you misuse the name of God, when you say His name in vain, Imagine the hurt that he feels and the rejection that he feels because of it. The fourth one is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. God tells us in this verse to work hard and to work hard for 6 days. He doesn't tell us to just sit and rest for 7. Let me make that clear. Don't sit and rest and have someone pay your bills. He says work hard. And work hard for those days. And then what happens after that? After that, he tells us to rest. And this rest is a gift. As Christians, we observe the Sabbath day on a Sunday. And the reason we do it is because we remember the day that Christ resurrected from the grave. Our faith is all about that resurrection of Jesus. As Ignatius, the first century believer, said, Christians no longer observe the Sabbath, but direct our lives towards the Lord's day, in which our lives are refreshed by him in his death. When you gather as a church on Sunday, when we gather together, we're remembering the Sabbath day. We're keeping it holy. Why? Because we're remembering what Christ did for us. And so, my question is, will you get to know these commandments? Will you pursue after them? Will you try to live for them? But here's the deal. You will, but you will fall short. But it was Christ who fulfilled them all, even when we couldn't. And so this is how I want to end, is chapter 32. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. Come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So Aaron said, take gold rings from the ears and your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me. All the people took the gold rings in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord. The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. Why did I end with that? Because here's the point. The Israelites who had just experienced the Ten Commandments got bored. And they turned to other gods. And they turned from God. But here's the thing. As we follow this story, and we'll do so next week and continuing, God still did not give up on them. And that's our story. God has not given up on us. So I don't know where you're at. But what I would encourage you to do is to understand and to love the Lord, to live for him, to keep his covenant, to try to keep his commands, but to also understand his grace and his mercy are new every morning. And not to just let that hold you down, because that is what Satan will put you down, and he'll try to push you down. But God has a greater plan for you than that. Will you pray with me?